Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another podcast. It's very cold and it's very bright, so I've decided to stay indoors today. I was going to go and have a go at fly fishing for pike on one of my local waters, but knowing the water as I do, I think there's virtually no chance of seeing a fish today. So what I'm going to do is chat about 5 of my favourite fly fishing books. I love reading about fly fishing, and it's a great way of drawing down some wonderful knowledge and entertaining yourself when conditions aren't suitable for fishing outside. The first book I'm going to look at is Fly Fishing for Grayling by John Roberts, first published 1999 by Excellent Press, ISBN 1900318199. You don't see many copies of this book available anymore. I picked mine up from Amazon a few years ago. You can still find it on Amazon, but I'd highly recommend you buy it if you were interested in fly fishing for grayling or just grayling in general. What I love about this book is it goes into real detail about the life cycle, the habits, the environment, as much as the methods and tactics. So you really get an insight into how grayling live, how they feed, where they spawn, etc. I'm going to read a short passage on the spawning habits of grayling. During the period leading up to late April and May, when the fish usually spawns, the female is noticeably fatter than the male, and the male much darker in colour. At spawning time, the shoals break up, and the mature fish congregate over light gravel. The males jealously guard the spawning beds from the trout and rival grayling. Roy Shaw, who has closely observed grayling spawning in the chalk waters of the Driffield Canal, has noticed as many as a dozen males for every female, but observations elsewhere suggest that this is unusual. After a period of frantic rushing about by both males and females, pairs will close, with the cockfish invariably to the right of the hen, and with the cock's huge dorsal fin held over the hen's body. The male's tail puts pressure on the wrist of the female's tail, ensuring that close lateral and downward contact is maintained. Both bodies vibrate and quiver together, so the gravel is pushed away by their tail movements. At the climax of this frenzy, the female lays their eggs, and seconds afterwards the male releases his milt on them. Grayling lay more eggs than brown trout. The figure varies in proportion to the weight of the females, anywhere between 7,000 and 37,500 per kilo of body weight. Between 3 and 6,000 is usual for a smaller fish. At the time of spawning, male grayling can be extremely aggressive in defending the area of the gravel bed. They will fight off intruding trout intent on eating the female's eggs. Trout anglers frequently claim that grayling thrive in a fishery that contains both species, and that trout stocks suffer because of the prolific egg production of grayling when compared to trout. Trout ensure that the level of grayling stocks is restricted by spawn consumption and predation of young grayling. The eggs are about 3 millimeters in diameter, and after a period of about 2 to 4 weeks, depending on water temperature, a steady 10 Celsius will take 18 days, or approximately 180 degree days in the UK. They will emerge from the gravel as alveons approximately 12 to 18 millimetres long. These young larvae shoal close to the surface and the riverbank until they reach about 25 millimetres. Then they return to deeper, faster water. They grow faster than trout or salmon at this age and will reach 100 to 180 millimetres by winter. Growth is fairly rapid, especially in the chalk streams, until maturity at 2 or 3 years of age for males and about 3 or 4 years for females. Fish will then be between 20 and 40 centimetres depending upon growth rates. The average size of fish varies from river to river. In most of the rain-fed rivers of the north of England, an average fish may be between 22 and 25 centimetres. But in a chalk stream, the average length might be 5 centimetres longer and the fish fatter. The appendix on page 147 gives an insight into different growth rates on British rivers. Ross Gardiner offered the hypothesis that in Scottish grayling, where the fastest growth rates were achieved in the larger rivers, this may be, at least in part, a density-related effect as a result of a shortage of suitable spawning or nursery areas in large rivers, limiting the numbers of grayling or competitor species. Dr. John Woodland also suggests that the difference in growth rates between the Upper Dee, slow growth, and the Dee at Corwin, faster growth, may have been due to the different grayling population densities. The greater densities were found at the upper site. In river fisheries, brown trout are stocked at least once a year, possibly more often. Grayling are very rarely stocked once a population has established itself. Most fisheries stock with trout of takeable size, anything from 25 to 45 centimetres or even larger. All these trout are carnivorous and will feed upon grayling eggs and fry. In a stocked river, it is possible that trout will oust grayling from their lies and prey on their young. Sometimes the presence of grayling in a river has been an easy scapegoat for trout anglers looking to blame something for poor fishing. I contend this is rarely the truth, and the reasons are likely to lie elsewhere. It is much more likely that overstocking with trout has led to a reduction in grayling stocks. The next book I'm going to look at is Keeper of the Stream by Frank Sawyer, first published in 1952 by A&C Black, ISBN 004-799-0260. This book has been republished several times, so it is still widely available second-hand. I don't think it's in print anymore, but you can pick up copies off Amazon and other second-hand book outlets. What I love about this book is that it documents Sawyer's life on the river, and the reader has the ability to draw down lots of his observations, his knowledge, invaluable lessons in fly fishing, which you won't really pick up from any kind of how-to guide. This is a little passage where Sawyer is observing the behaviour of some nymphs in the river. I sat near the edge of the river to watch the hatch of fly and the rising trout, and as I studied the water, I saw a number of nymphs leave the flannel weed bed and swim rapidly to the surface. But here, instead of breaking through the film and hatching, or returning to the bottom as is often their procedure, the insects swam quickly along just under the surface film. The surface was perfectly clear, and as each insect swam along, its small body caused a disturbance, a tiny ripple, a movement quite easy to follow. Though I watched several of the nymphs swim a distance of 6 feet, the general swimming journey was not more than 2 or 3 feet. Each time the insects stopped, they tried to force their thorax up into the air, in which some succeeded quickly, but most of them made anything from 6 to a dozen attempts. Immediately the thorax came through the film, the shuck split and the fly emerged, in most cases to fly away almost at once. Now, I was rather interested to know just how far the nymphs would float or swim downstream before hatching. So I carefully watched 4 different insects, 2 olives, a pale watery, and an iron blue. To do this, I went upstream about 80 yards above the hatches, and as soon as I saw a nymph reach the surface film from the bed of the river, I followed it as it moved with the slow current downstream. The first, a medium olive, hatched after I had taken 37 paces. The second, a pale watery, when I had taken but 7. The third and fourth drifted down together, the iron blue hatching when I had taken 61 strides, but the olive, another medium olive, failed to hatch until it reached some floating weeds, which were checked above the set of hatches. I saw this nymph cling tightly to a strand of weed and then come crawling through the film of water to hatch. On their journeys downstream, many attempts were made by each nymph in an endeavour to hatch, swimming here and there, struggling to and fro. and at times drifting completely inert. All this interests me greatly. Here was a big movement of nymphs and a hatch of flies to be studied as easily as in a glass aquarium. Flies of 4 different families, all hatching together and finding the same difficulty. As I watched the water, I could see the surface was moving in 3 layers, 3 different films, and the toughest of these was that nearest to the air. I lay down at full length with my head over the water and watched intently, and cursed myself for not having a magnifying glass with me. I could see several nymphs playing about on the riverbed, and then one came gliding up towards my nose. I was looking into a kind of backwater behind a jutting bank, and my eyes were not more than 6 inches from the nymph as it reached the surface. I saw it struggle to force its way through the film, and the film bulge upwards as though made of elastic. Again and again it tried, with pauses to regain energy. I counted the number of attempts, and on the 17th it succeeded. The thorax came pushing through to the air and immediately split just in front of the wing cases. And without any difficulty, the fly, a medium olive, emerged and took flight. I watched others, pale wateries, iron blues, and lesser spurwings, all hatch at the same spot, and all had the same difficulty. I have a real soft spot for very old fly fishing and fishing books. It's lovely to read about how things were 100 or so years ago, and they're often written in quite an eccentric style. This one is called How to Fish by W. Earl Hodgson. It's published 1907 by Adam and Charles Black. In this short passage, Hodgson is preparing an assault on the etiquette of the sport, in particular the southern school of dry fly fishing. Courage was called for at the close of the last chapter. Flies having been considered, the next subject must be other lures, and none of these escapes the practically unanimous disapproval of the southern trout fishers resident in London. The gravity of the situation pressed upon me. Had I not already, over trout fishing, sufficiently incurred the frown of the sportsman who the field with sympathy calls the serious-minded dry fly purist? Had not that important person given the world to understand, through the sturdy pen of Mr. A. E. Gaythorne Hardy, that having fished with damp flies on a dry fly stream is somewhat akin to a poacher? If a dipping fly was an offence, what would be thought of lures still further from the odour of sanctity and paraffin? While these misgivings were heavy, the postman brought the Times. With a feeling of relief from anxiety, I quitted the writing table for the armchair by the fireplace. To calm the mind, I would read the literary supplement to begin with. The very first paragraph sent a thrill through brain and body. It ran thus: "Nothing in history is more mysterious or more attractive than the reoccurrence of these periods, always short, when science and the arts seem really to be born again. For our part, at the back of them we divine some great upheaval in philosophy, some eruption of general ideas, new and, so to speak, explosive, or at least active. Biologists inform us that, in animal life, a sudden change of diet is favourable, because the cells of our structure become so stalled and satiated with their habitual food that they cease to assimilate the nourishment which it continues to contain. The man who starves on his stalled ox may flourish on a dinner of bitter herbs. And so, in the larger structure of society, a certain callousness prevents our coming into contact with truths when they are traditional and time-worn to excess. Use and want have dulled them. They nourish and augment us on longer. and we formulate them half unconsciously with so trifling an expense of mind that our faculties dwindle from lack of exercise. What reflection could have been so stimulatingly opportune? The subject which the Times was preparing to discuss was not, it is true, ours. It was the secret of the Renaissance, as affected by Mr. George Wyndham's Ronsard and Le Plaid. Still, what the Times said was not less applicable to angling than poetry. Thoughts that had long been waiting to spark that will crystallise them suddenly took definitive expression. It is clear, I said to myself, that angling needs a renaissance. Purism has the sport in bondage. Sternly I rebuked myself for having wavered. I would be up and at the purist whenever I had read the wise old journal. I would analyse the state of mind. Of course I would deal with him, as Walton impaled the frog, tenderly and as if I loved him. This next book is another reasonably old fishing book. It's actually a fishing and shooting book, and it's called Come Fishing and Shooting, written by Major Vivian Bailey, first published by George D. Harrop and Co. Limited, 1961, SBN 856178241. I think occasionally on the riverbank we all have the misfortune of meeting, shall we say, a pompous angler who maybe thinks they're slightly better than you, and is no different through history either. And in this short passage, Major Bailey is describing such an encounter. Shortly after my return, my father and mother and I went for a week or 10 days to a hotel on the Teme in Hertfordshire. The river fishing was a complete washout, but the owner of the hotel and surrounding estate lived in a large house nearby, with a very beautiful lake reputed to hold very large trout. Accordingly, I made it my business to make his acquaintance and secure permission to go and fish there. The mayfly had been over for some 10 days, and the usual period of slump which always follows the mayfly was in full swing. It's a curious phenomenon that this very lifeless spell invariably comes. A common belief is that the fish are gorged and sated, and will look at nothing. I do not think that this is really the case. I believe the real reason is that by freak of nature there is at that time hardly any hatch of fly. When a few moth and sedge come out late in the evening, the reputedly gorged fish will usually have a go at these. For 2 days I tried the lake with no success whatever, and returned to the hotel for dinner. The following day the daughter of the house came to the hotel and invited me to go for supper and go out in the boat afterwards, where she promised to take a friend out who was staying in the house. We embarked at about 8:30. It was the first time I had ever fished from a boat. I had in fact no previous experience of lake fishing. The guest in the house was an eminent barrister. He may have been eloquent in court, but in the boat he was giving nothing away. I asked him whether, when fishing dry, he moved his fly or let it sit. His reply, in a very superior voice, was, "Oh, I do a lot of things with my fly," implying that my lack of skill was such that it would be quite hopeless for me to attempt to emulate his artistry. He was an insufferable man, and a perfect example of what a fisherman should not be. The more I fish, the more I have come to believe that a fisherman, if asked by a less experienced companion, should be ready to give all the advice and help he can, and share his ideas, experiences, and, if necessary, his fly box. There were no such flies on the insufferable barrister. It was one of those perfect evenings without a breath of wind, and as the sun sank there was a lovely lemon glow in the northwest. We fished till 10 o'clock, and although there was a fair rise for half an hour, neither of us raised a fish to our fly. My guest elected for home and said it was hopeless. My hostess asked me what I should like to do. I asked if I could change a fly before we went down the lake for the last time, and I mounted a small white moth. Not the least of the factors contributing to success in a boat is the skill of the boatman. My hostess was supreme, and I was tremendously impressed with her skill. Where there is a stream or wind, the control of adrift is a fairly simple matter. But in a lake, on an evening of dead calm, where the slightest ripple from boat or sculls would put fish down a long way out, a very high degree of skill is essential. We were about halfway across the lake, and darkness was very nearly on us. Looking to the northwest into the reflection of the water of the very last of the afterglow, I saw a cruising fish coming across from left to right, at just about extreme casting range. I got line out and put my white moth in front of him into what I hoped was his path. I could just see my fly sitting on the water. I saw him take a fly, then another, and then, glory of glories, mine. The line tightened and the battle was on, to the intense disgust of the insufferable one. The lake was deep, but without any obstructions, we eventually netted him, 4 pounds 2 ounces, the best trout I had ever killed. The following evening was our last day, and we repeated the programme, fortunately without the barrister, who had to return to London. That night I had the stern seat instead of being perched in the bows, and had 2 fish, 4 pounds and 3 pounds 12 ounces. My next book is The History of Fly Fishing in 50 Flies by Ian Whitelaw, published by Aurum Press 2015, ISBN 978 178 131 4012. This is a really wonderful book. It looks at the story behind 50 famous fishing flies. The passage I'm going to read is about James Ogden, pioneer of a few different flies. But this particular story relives an event behind one of the tales of the birth of modern dry fly fishing. James Ogden, 1803 to 1880, was brought up in Derbyshire, where he learnt to fish wet flies on the River Wye with his father, and after moving to Cheltenham, he returned frequently to fish his home waters. In 1864, he was staying at an inn called the Peacock at Roseley, close to the confluence of the rivers Wye and Derwent, and just a few miles from Haddon Hall, country home of the Duke of Rutland, whose emblem, incidentally, is a male peacock. The Wye, which runs through the Haddon estate, was famous for its hatch of drakes, during which anglers would cast live mayflies and catch huge numbers of trout. While at the inn, Ogden was approached by Robert Nesfield, the Duke's steward, who was looking for a way to maintain the sport fishing on the estate waters while reducing the size of the catch, and he asked Ogden whether his dry flies would catch trout even during the hatch, a feat that the local anglers considered impossible. Ogden confidently accepted the challenge, as well as an invitation to return the following June in time for the hatch. On 5th June 1865, Ogden was duly stationed on the River Wye, rod in hand and equipped with a dry mayfly. Word of the challenge had spread, and an enthusiastic band of spectators watched from the nearby bridge. As Ogden recounts, "After well soaking my cast and testing it, I put on one of my artificial drakes, which looked very tempting, dressed as follows: a straw body, ribbed with red silk well waxed, tail, 3 strands of hen pheasant tail feather, hackle, a pale buff with brown centre, rather short in fibre, wings upright, taken from the wood or summer duck. I made a cast to the fish I saw rise first. My fly had scarcely touched the water when it was taken. Indeed, one of the onlookers shouted that he must be using a live drake, as it had alighted on the water like a natural fly. Ogden proceeded to catch 9 good fish, and then waded into the water, with the steward's permission, as wading was forbidden on the Haddon stretch and still is, to cast to a fish that was rising in mid-river. Having hooked it, he found his foot stuck in the silt of the riverbed, and he toppled backwards into the water, dropping his rod in the process. But he managed to land the trout before retiring to the inn for a change of clothes. His point had been made, and, as Ogden tells us, a member of his audience called out, "If he hadn't fell in, he'd have killed every fish in the water." When he returned to the same spot the next morning to meet up with the steward, Ogden found himself very unpopular with a group of local anglers. He decided against fishing there again and said as much to the steward, who replied, "Never mind, Ogden, you've carried out my wishes, and from this morning I have prohibited all natural fly fishing. If they cannot kill with the artificial, they shall not with the live fly." This was the very first introduction of a dry fly only rule, one that would soon be applied to many of the chalk streams of southern England and far beyond. Well, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you would like any information on our fly fishing coaching, please visit us at www.peaksflyfishing.com, or to buy our fishing flies, it's shop.peaksflyfishing.com. Until next time, thank you, bye bye.